Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We are starting Unit 2, if you're in one of my classes, the elements of drama. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is how drama is different than short fiction. I start with short fiction in Unit 1 because there are literary elements and conventions that are similar to those used in drama and also in poetry. And it's a little bit easier to kind of identify those in a short story. It's a little bit more of a sort of user-friendly format. But the essential question we're going to begin with here is how does drama provide the reader a different experience than prose, short stories and novels, or poetry? Before we get into the answer for that question, I want to give you just a little bit of background. Drama comes from the Greek word dran, meaning to do or act. The doing or acting makes the drama. So we're looking at some things here just on the page, but I just want you to know dramas really are meant to be acted in front of an audience. And for that reason, especially with the short plays, I'll be providing you some links for different interpretations of those plays. When people put them into production, some of the choices that they make in costuming, in casting the play, they make a huge difference. If you've ever seen a movie and then its remake, you'll know just how good or horrible that can be, right? This is a small theater in the sort of shape of an amphitheater, and the Greeks were really well known for putting on quite a number of dramas. We believe that this form of literature sort of started in ancient Greece. They had a round theater of this type, an amphitheater, outside, and the shape would allow people who obviously at that point did not have microphones or electricity, it would allow their voices to carry, and so they would put on these wonderful festivals with numerous plays, some tragedies and some comedies, and a wider audience would be able to hear them. So the types of drama, the first sort of mini unit within our larger unit here, we're going to be looking at comedy second, I think, but we'll talk about comedy first in this case. So there's two features of dramatic comedies. The first is that they make people laugh. And this is where I think a lot of people start. If it's a comedy, it should be funny, right? This is a picture from one of Shakespeare's comedies, which we're not reading. This is The Merry Wives of Windsor, and we have Falstaff, the fat, aging knight, who is trying to trick a wealthy woman into marrying him, and he writes to several women who then try to trick and play jokes on him to try to sort of humiliate him. And you can kind of see how ridiculous this play might be just given this little picture here. The other aspect of a dramatic comedy is that it has a happy ending, which basically means that the protagonist succeeds in meeting his or her goals. So technically, under this definition, Cinderella, which is pictured here on the bottom, a stage version of Cinderella, Cinderella is a comedy. Not necessarily because it's funny and makes people laugh, but because the protagonist, Cinderella herself, succeeds in rising above her station, getting away from her wicked stepmother, marrying the prince. The other type of drama is tragedy, and the two main features of a tragedy is that the opposite of a comedy. So in a comedy, the protagonist, the hero of the piece, the main character, succeeds in reaching their goals. In a tragedy, there's the downfall of the protagonist, often a person of great significance like a king or a hero. Now, I have another lecture about the comedy we're going to be reading, Pygmalion, and I have a separate lecture about the tragedy we're going to be reading, the play Doubt. And a couple notes in this lecture about the short plays, the short one-act plays. But the thing about Doubt is that I think the central question is, who is the protagonist in that play? Because we have two characters and it sort of depends on your interpretation. At any rate, both people sort of have their own downfall. In traditional tragedies, a lot of times the protagonist dies. If you think of something like Hamlet, which this is, I think, from Oedipus, a Greek tragedy. This woman is just finding out that she accidentally, without knowing who her son was, she married him. Everyone dies in a tragedy. Not all the time, but in traditional tragedies, you do have a death of some sort. Sometimes it's the protagonist, sometimes not. So in Oedipus, the king has a downfall. He does not die, but other people in his sort of circle do. And there we have Hamlet considering death. I knew him well as he holds the skull of his former friend. Similarities to short fiction. That's just a picture from a musical comedy, Grease. There's the author, who here is called the playwright, as opposed to just the author. Characterization, plot, conflict, themes, and setting, and symbolism, all of those things are still going to be in a play. So a lot of the things that we talked about when we're looking at short stories are in dramas as well. So let's take a look at some of the little differences here. With a plot, this is kind of the typical plot outline we talked about before. There's an inciting incident or some type of exposition, the rising action, the climax, which is the turning point, the falling action, and then a resolution. So a drama, the plot is broken up very distinctly. In a short story, you have to kind of identify where these turning points are. Where is the exposition? Where's the rising action? Where's the climax or the turning point, right? But in a drama, it's broken up into acts, which are the units of action. That's what acts kind of stands for. Scenes are parts of those acts. So think of an act, if you're reading a novel, an act is like a chapter, and maybe scenes would be like a paragraph, right? Sometimes you'll have an act that's just one scene long. Sometimes an act will be several different scenes. And apparently I have updates available. Okay. Scenes or acts split a couple different ways. Number one, action takes place in a different location. Scenery needs to be changed. Costumes need to change, or characters leave a room, or time passes. Now, you'll notice that sometimes the action or a scene ends or splits for very practical purposes because these are being performed. So if you need to change scenery because the action takes place in a new location, if the main character has to go and change their clothes, there has to be something called an act break. And if you've ever been to a play, you'll notice that during the act break, a lot of times the lights dim, the stage goes dark, the stagehands come out and shuffle things around. And then sometimes in the middle of the play, they'll also take an intermission. So a time for people to come and stretch their legs. A lot of times that intermission takes place during the climax or turning point of the play, so that they leave you hanging and you go and you talk about what you just saw and what might come next. These are some examples of act breaks, how act breaks work on TV. Television originally was really structured after plays, and there are people who wrote plays for the stage and then adapted them for the screen, for movies or for television. So this is a picture of The Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory is a 30-minute sitcom. Now, if you've ever seen it without ads, it's about 18 minutes long. It's one of the shortest television shows on TV in terms of actual minutes on TV. It's popular, and the more popular it got, the more ads they sold. But at any rate, I digress. So a 30-minute comedy is set up like this. In Act 1, we have the inciting... That slipped a little bit there. Sorry, guys. In Act 1, we have the inciting incident. And then we have some points along our little roller coaster here. Something happens, and they talk about it. And then in Act 2, things become more complicated. And then and there's the turning point or the climax. And then in Act 3, there's the falling action and resolution. And at these points is a break for ads. And the typical setup is, in a comedy especially, Act 1 is the problem, Act 2 is the complication, Act 3 is the resolution. This is how almost all half-hour comedies are set up. Older comedies, at least. We get into things on Netflix and things with streaming where you're binge watching and they kind of extend this a little bit more. But traditional half-hour comedies are all set up that way, okay? It also is important because in a comedy, the resolution, the problem is solved. The protagonist reaches his or her goals. We laugh with them along the way. Right? And then they come to a place where they're sort of happy with the solution. Now, in a drama, a 1-hour drama, like here we have Law and Order, this is set up in a 5-act structure. So we usually have the inciting moment on its own. Act 1 almost is like one scene, right? We find the body. Someone runs into the police station needing help, okay? And sometimes maybe a little bit of exposition. Then we have the complications to that problem. And sometimes we'll have a split here as we rise in the action. Act 3 usually is the climax, the turning point, or the twist. And then we have the falling action, and then the resolution. This is a lot of times how Shakespeare's plays are set up as well. Most of Shakespeare's plays are done in 5 acts, and they come through on this pattern. We have the problem, we have the complications, we have a turning point, we have the falling action, we have the resolution. Whether it is a drama or a comedy with Shakespeare's work, this is the pattern that you will see. And it's interesting to me that Shakespeare is hundreds of years old, and yet we're still using the same pattern. If you watch Law and Order, when the acts break, that is where you have a break for ads. And it's interesting. That's almost like the intermission where people would go and buy food in the lobby and take a break for a minute, that we have this advertising break instead. But if you ever watch Law and Order, or Law and Order SVU as is pictured above, with Ice-T, a detective, and Mariska Hargitay, if you ever watch Law and Order, it is set up like this. Watch for the inciting incident, look for the pieces of rising action. Usually around this point, there's some further complication or a twist or a revelation about something that they didn't know before. At this point is the highest point of tension, another twist, another turning point in the case, or we finally kind of figured it out, and then falling action, and then a resolution. Sometimes they'll tack a little thing on here at the end of the resolution with like, oh, last twist, and then they close and it says Dick Wolf at the end. But usually not. Usually it follows this pattern. This is a picture of Game of Thrones. Now, what's interesting to me, just from a structural standpoint, again, I know I'm talking about TV, but I think you can really relate it to the plays that we're looking at. Same kind of structure, just one happens to be on a stage and one happens to be on your screen. With shows like Game of Thrones, and I really saw this happening starting with Lost and The Sopranos. With shows like this, they're doing these plot points over a really long time. So you have a longer time to give exposition. You have time to do world building. You have many more points of rising action, small climaxes here and there. I don't even know, sometimes you'll have this plot arc in one episode and sometimes you'll have it happen over the course of the season. So it's interesting to me how, for hundreds of years, we've kept kind of the same plot arc over and over and over. And certainly since 1950, that's the way it's been on TV, half-hour comedies, hour-long dramas. And before that, since 1920, with movies as well. Because the form has changed, you have much more intricate storytelling. We're really in the second golden age of television, to be honest with you. You have really intricate storytelling. You have more time to build worlds, more time to do characterization. Now, the nice thing is that with the plays we're reading, you don't have time for that. So you have to get a lot of information, strong characterization, strong symbols, compelling plot lines, sometimes, as with the one-act plays, within one act, which is usually like, I think the one play we're going to watch is 7 minutes long. So how can you build up characterization in 7 to 20 minutes? That's sort of an interesting and kind of opposite question. So let's take a look at some of these other elements. Characterization is done a little bit differently in a play than in a story. The characters' names and primary relationships are often listed at the beginning of the text. So it'll have the cast of characters so that you know who will be there before you start reading. And then you'll have their names with a colon and then just their dialogue. In short fiction, as I talked about before, we find out information about a character's personality through a couple different things. What they say or think, what they do, what other characters say or think about them. And in plays, we sort of have all of that still. We have what people say. Sometimes we get what people think as well. We'll talk about that in a little bit. What they do, obviously, is being acted out before us. And other times, what other people say or do or how they act around them. But in plays, we also learn about characters by how they look or dress, what their environment looks like, and how actors portray them. So this is Philip Seymour Hoffman, who died not that long ago. He played the priest in the movie version of the play we're going to read. But here, he was a character actor. And here are 3 different characters. Now you can see just by how they're dressed, right? The first guy is kind of like a stoner type. The second guy, very buttoned up, very uptight, right? And the third guy on the bottom, just kind of rough around the edges, wants to have a drink with his buddies and is having a pint there, right? So even by how he's dressed, and in some ways his body gesture, his body language in all 3 of these pictures as well, really does add to the characterization. So when you are reading the play, we'll talk about stage directions in the second part of this lecture, which I think I'm going to do separately. But look for the stage directions, look for how the characters are dressed, what they're wearing, if it's listed. Certainly when we get to Pygmalion, what the character wears, what Eliza, the main character, wears becomes quite important. In the beginning, she's a beggar, almost. She's selling flowers on the streets, almost a begging, not quite there yet. And in the end, she's almost treated like royalty. So her clothing choices have a lot to do with that. Other things like performance elements, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but there's a lot that goes into acting. Verbal expressions, breath control, vocal expression, facial expression. This picture here of the girl making a lot of different facial expressions. Inflection, projection, diction, how we pronounce the words, how the actor or actress uses their voice to convey the character. So again, a lot of this you're not going to be able to see on the page, and you kind of have to just picture it for yourself or think about how you think it should be read. So I'm going to stop there because I'm coming up on 20 minutes. So I'm going to have another lecture where I look at the other elements of drama, and we'll talk about things like props and dialogue and all of that. And I will hopefully see you in a couple minutes.